Sometimes, destiny does not knock on your door, it crashes into your life when you least expect it. Ethan Carter had repeated those words countless times to frightened patients who believed their worst day would define the rest of their lives, but he never imagined they would become true for him just after 2 o'clock on a stormy Friday morning. His 12-hour shift at Lakeshore Medical Center had finally ended, leaving him physically exhausted yet unable to ignore the violent thunder echoing across the dark Chicago skyline. Rain poured relentlessly against the windshield as Ethan drove home along the quiet lakeside highway, thinking only about a hot shower and a few precious hours of sleep before returning to another demanding shift. Suddenly, an explosion of bright orange light illuminated the clouds above the lake. Ethan instinctively slammed on the brakes as a sleek private jet descended at an impossible angle before disappearing beyond the shoreline with a deafening splash that sent towering waves crashing against the rocks. For a brief second, complete silence followed. Then distant emergency alarms began echoing through the night. Without hesitation, Ethan grabbed the emergency medical kit he always carried in his vehicle and sprinted toward the water. Several drivers had already stopped along the roadside, but no one entered the freezing lake. They stood frozen, watching the wreckage slowly sink beneath the storm-dark surface. Ethan did not waste a single moment asking questions. Years of emergency nursing had taught him that every second could mean the difference between life and death. He pulled off his heavy jacket, secured a rescue rope around his waist after handing the other end to 2 bystanders, took one deep breath, and plunged into the icy water. The current fought against him with surprising strength as rain reduced visibility to only a few feet. Pieces of floating luggage and broken interior panels drifted across the surface while the aircraft continued disappearing beneath the lake. Guided only by instinct and the flashing emergency lights reflecting across the waves, Ethan reached the partially submerged cabin. Through a fractured window, he spotted movement. A tall man remained trapped by a twisted seatbelt, his eyes barely open, one trembling hand resting protectively across his abdomen even while struggling to remain conscious. Ethan forced the damaged door wider, carefully freed the restraint, and supported the stranger before both disappeared briefly beneath the water. Fighting the cold and the increasing weight of soaked clothing, Ethan slowly guided the unconscious passenger toward the surface until nearby rescue personnel reached them with an inflatable raft. Once safely ashore, Ethan immediately checked breathing, pulse, and body temperature while paramedics prepared advanced equipment. The stranger remained alive but dangerously exhausted, his expensive tailored clothing soaked beyond recognition, revealing nothing except that he had clearly come from a life far different than Ethan's own. As the ambulance doors closed, Ethan climbed inside without waiting for permission because the patient had no family present and no medical history available. During the ride, he noticed something unusual. Despite the accident, the man's protective posture around his abdomen never completely relaxed, even while unconscious. Ethan quietly made a mental note to request additional examinations after arrival, believing there could be an underlying medical condition requiring immediate attention. He still had no idea who the mysterious patient was. To Ethan, he was simply another life worth saving. Outside the ambulance windows, dozens of police vehicles, fire engines, and emergency crews flooded the crash scene while helicopters circled overhead. Hidden several miles away, multiple black sport utility vehicles accelerated through the rain after receiving one urgent message through encrypted communication. Their destination was not the lake. It was the hospital where the rescued passenger had just been taken, and before sunrise, Ethan Carter's quiet act of compassion would begin changing both of their lives forever. The ambulance arrived at Lakeshore Medical Center just before 3 o'clock in the morning as heavy rain continued pounding against the emergency entrance. Ethan Carter stepped out first, immediately helping the trauma team transfer the unconscious passenger onto a hospital stretcher. Every movement followed the precise rhythm developed through years of emergency nursing. Vital signs were monitored, warm intravenous fluids were started, and physicians quickly began evaluating the injuries caused by prolonged exposure to freezing water. Although the patient had escaped with remarkably few external injuries, his body temperature remained dangerously low, and everyone focused on stabilizing him before asking any questions about the accident. Ethan remained beside the examination room longer than necessary, quietly reporting every detail he had witnessed at the crash site. He carefully mentioned one observation that continued troubling him. He kept protecting his abdomen even while unconscious, Ethan explained to the attending physician. It looked completely instinctive. The physician nodded thoughtfully before ordering additional diagnostic imaging as a precaution. While waiting for the results, Ethan carefully removed the soaked jacket and personal belongings that had been placed inside sealed evidence bags. There was still no identification available because the passenger's wallet and electronic devices had been damaged by the lake. To the hospital staff, he remained simply an unidentified survivor. Nearly an hour later, the examination results appeared on the secure medical system. Ethan happened to be standing beside the attending physician when the confidential report loaded onto the screen. Both stared silently for several seconds before the physician quietly closed the file. The findings revealed something extraordinarily unexpected. The patient was an alpha carrying a healthy pregnancy that appeared to have progressed safely despite the accident. Ethan looked toward the unconscious man with genuine concern rather than surprise. Medical confidentiality immediately became his highest priority. He calmly asked every unnecessary staff member to leave the room before lowering his voice. "The fewer people who know this information tonight, the better," he said respectfully. The physician agreed without hesitation. "Only essential personnel will have access." Ethan nodded, understanding exactly what that meant. Regardless of the patient's identity, personal circumstances, or social position, his medical privacy deserved complete protection. Outside the treatment area, the quiet hospital atmosphere changed almost instantly. One security guard hurried toward the emergency entrance after noticing a convoy of identical black sport utility vehicles pulling into the parking lot. Within seconds, nearly 10 vehicles lined the entrance in perfect formation. Men dressed in dark business suits stepped out calmly without creating panic or raising their voices. Their disciplined movements immediately suggested professional training rather than ordinary visitors. Hospital staff exchanged confused glances while administrators hurried toward the lobby. Ethan noticed the unusual activity through the hallway windows but returned his attention to his patient. He refused to abandon someone still recovering simply because influential visitors had arrived. Moments later, the emergency department doors opened once again. A composed middle-aged man carrying official identification quietly introduced himself as Daniel Brooks. His voice remained calm and respectful as he spoke with hospital administrators. "We are searching for the survivor of tonight's aviation accident. His safety is our highest priority." After verifying his credentials, the hospital director escorted Daniel into a private consultation room. Ethan continued adjusting warm blankets around the unconscious alpha before hearing soft footsteps behind him. He turned to find Daniel standing silently at the doorway, his expression shifting from controlled professionalism to visible relief the moment he saw the patient breathing peacefully. Daniel lowered his head gratefully toward Ethan. "Were you the one who rescued him?" Ethan answered with simple honesty. "I only happened to be nearby." Daniel smiled faintly. Sometimes that is exactly where destiny places the right person. Before Ethan could ask another question, the unconscious alpha slowly moved one hand across his abdomen once again, as though instinctively reassuring the tiny life growing inside him. Daniel noticed the gesture immediately, and for the first time that night, genuine emotion briefly appeared behind his composed expression. He understood that the greatest secret entrusted to the hospital had survived the crash, but he also realized someone else now shared that secret. Standing quietly beside the hospital bed, Ethan still had no idea the patient he had rescued from the freezing lake was Sebastian Hayes, one of the most powerful Mafia alphas in the country, and before dawn arrived, that single act of compassion would place Ethan's ordinary life directly in the path of extraordinary destiny. The first rays of morning sunlight had barely reached the windows of Lakeshore Medical Center when Sebastian Hayes finally opened his eyes. His breathing remained steady, but confusion briefly crossed his face as unfamiliar white ceilings replaced the dark storm clouds he remembered. Before he could move, Ethan Carter quietly stepped beside the hospital bed to check his temperature and heart monitor. "Good morning," Ethan said gently. "You are safe. Please do not try to sit up too quickly." Sebastian studied the young Omega nurse standing beside him. His memories returned in scattered fragments. Violent rain. The private jet. Freezing water. Then a pair of determined blue eyes refusing to leave him behind. He lowered his gaze toward his abdomen almost instinctively before looking back at Ethan. How long have I been here? He asked calmly. About 6 hours, Ethan answered. Your body responded well to treatment, but you still need rest. Sebastian noticed the careful choice of words. Ethan had not mentioned the confidential examination results, nor had he shown the slightest hint of curiosity about his identity. That silence earned Sebastian's respect far more quickly than any introduction could have. A soft knock interrupted the quiet room as Daniel Brooks entered carrying a neatly folded black suit and several sealed folders. Relief immediately appeared across his face. You are awake. Sebastian nodded slightly. Everyone else? Daniel understood the question without further explanation. The investigation is still ongoing, but the authorities confirmed that you were the only survivor. Sebastian closed his eyes briefly, silently honoring those who had not reached safety. Ethan respectfully stepped back, allowing the two men a private moment while continuing to monitor the medical equipment from the opposite side of the room. Several minutes later Daniel approached Ethan with sincere gratitude. Our family owes you more than words can express. Ethan smiled politely. I only did what any emergency nurse should do. Daniel quietly shook his head. Most people stopped at the shoreline. You did not. Before Ethan could respond, another physician entered carrying updated examination results. He spoke carefully so only essential personnel could hear. The pregnancy remains stable. Both patients are doing remarkably well after everything they experienced. Ethan noticed Sebastian release the smallest breath of relief. For the first time since waking, the reserved alpha allowed genuine emotion to soften his composed expression. Ethan understood immediately that the greatest concern had never been his own recovery. It had always been the tiny life he was protecting. Respect quietly replaced professional curiosity inside Ethan's heart. Later that afternoon Sebastian insisted on reviewing discharge options despite the medical team's recommendation that he remain under observation until the following morning. Ethan patiently explained every precaution without raising his voice. You survived freezing water, severe exhaustion, and hypothermia. One extra night here is not a punishment. It is protection. Sebastian looked at him thoughtfully before giving a small nod. Very few people ever spoke to him with such calm honesty, and even fewer expected nothing in return. He agreed without argument. As evening approached, Ethan finally ended his shift and returned to his modest lakeside home, believing the extraordinary events of the previous night had finally come to an end. He made a simple dinner, answered a brief call from his older sister, and sat quietly near the living room window while gentle rain continued falling outside. Then, just after sunset, the peaceful neighborhood became unusually still. One after another, 10 identical black sport utility vehicles slowly turned onto his quiet residential street before stopping directly in front of his small house. Neighbors watched from their windows in stunned silence as professionally dressed men stepped out in perfect order. Ethan remained standing beside the window, completely speechless. He had no way of knowing whether the visitors had arrived to thank him, question him, or ask something that would change his ordinary life forever, but as the lead vehicle door slowly opened and Daniel Brooks stepped onto the sidewalk with a respectful smile, Ethan realized the rescue at the lake had never truly ended. It had only been the beginning. Daniel Brooks stopped several feet from Ethan Carter's front porch, keeping his hands visible and his expression calm. The line of black sport utility vehicles remained parked neatly along the quiet street, creating an unforgettable sight that drew curious glances from every neighboring window. Ethan opened his front door cautiously, surprised by the unexpected visitors but refusing to let fear replace courtesy. Daniel offered a respectful nod before speaking. Good evening, Mr. Carter. I apologize for arriving without notice. Ethan looked from Daniel to the long convoy before answering with gentle honesty. I think my neighbors will remember this evening for a very long time. Daniel smiled apologetically. Unfortunately, discretion is sometimes difficult for people in our position. Ethan stepped aside and invited him inside while several security professionals remained outside, giving the conversation as much privacy as possible. His small living room reflected the simplicity of his daily life. Medical textbooks rested neatly on one shelf beside framed family photographs and a modest collection of indoor plants. Daniel quietly admired the peaceful atmosphere before placing a carefully wrapped gift box on the coffee table. "Mr. Hayes asked me to personally thank you for saving his life," he explained. Ethan immediately shook his head. "Please tell him gratitude is unnecessary. Anyone working in emergency medicine would have done exactly the same thing." Daniel looked at him thoughtfully. "I do not believe that is true. Many people witnessed the crash. You were the only one who entered the water before rescue teams arrived." Ethan remained silent for a moment before answering softly. "I saw someone who still had a chance. That was enough." Daniel then removed a sealed envelope from his briefcase. "There is also another request. Mr. Hayes would like to meet you once he receives medical clearance." Ethan looked surprised. "Why?" Daniel answered honestly. "Because he prefers thanking people personally." Ethan smiled politely but gently pushed the envelope back across the table. "Please tell him there is no need for gifts, rewards, or special treatment. I was simply doing my job." Daniel did not appear offended. Instead, genuine admiration crossed his face. "That is exactly what I expected you would say." Before leaving, Daniel hesitated briefly. "There is one matter I hope you understand. Mr. Hayes's medical condition is extremely private." Ethan immediately nodded. "His records are protected by law and by my professional ethics. No one will hear a single word from me." Daniel's expression relaxed with visible relief. "Thank you. That answer means more than you realize." After the visitors departed, the neighborhood slowly returned to its usual quiet rhythm, but the unusual convoy remained the only topic of conversation among nearby residents. Ethan simply prepared for another overnight shift, determined to continue living as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Meanwhile, across the city inside a private rehabilitation suite, Sebastian Hayes stood beside a large window overlooking Chicago. His recovery had progressed well, yet his thoughts repeatedly returned to the Omega nurse who had risked everything for a complete stranger. Daniel quietly entered the room and described the evening visit in detail, including Ethan's refusal to accept expensive gifts or personal favors. Sebastian listened without interrupting before allowing a faint smile to appear. "He refused everything?" Daniel nodded. "Everything except the opportunity to keep treating people tomorrow." Sebastian looked toward the city lights with quiet respect. "Then I chose the right person to trust." The following morning, Ethan returned to Lakeshore Medical Center expecting another ordinary shift, but the hospital director greeted him with unexpected news. A private patient had specifically requested one nurse for ongoing confidential medical care, and although the director never spoke the patient's name aloud, Ethan immediately recognized who the request could only belong to. Standing silently in the brightly lit hallway, he realized that the rescue at the lake had created a connection neither time nor distance intended to break. Later that afternoon, Ethan Carter was escorted through a private entrance rarely used by ordinary hospital staff. The exclusive medical suite occupied an isolated floor designed for patients requiring complete confidentiality, where every hallway remained quiet and access required multiple security clearances. Ethan carried only his medical tablet and examination equipment, treating the assignment exactly as he would any other patient. Outside the suite, Daniel Brooks greeted him with a warm smile. "Thank you for accepting the request." Ethan answered honestly. "The hospital assigned me. I am here as a nurse, nothing more." Daniel appreciated the response and quietly opened the door. Inside the spacious recovery room, Sebastian Hayes stood near a large window overlooking Lake Michigan. He had exchanged his hospital gown for comfortable dark clothing, though he still appeared slightly pale from the recent accident. When he turned, his expression softened with genuine recognition. "Good afternoon, Ethan." Ethan smiled politely while maintaining professional composure. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes. How are you feeling today?" Sebastian answered truthfully. "Much better than I expected." Ethan began the examination with calm efficiency, carefully checking blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen levels, and body temperature before reviewing updated laboratory results. Everything suggested steady recovery from the near drowning, yet one set of numbers immediately caught his attention. Ethan quietly reviewed the report a second time before looking toward Sebastian. "I would like to perform one additional examination if you agree." Sebastian nodded without hesitation. "Go ahead." A few minutes later, after completing the assessment, Ethan carefully compared every result against the previous hospital records. The findings revealed a subtle but important change. Although the pregnancy remained healthy, several measurements indicated an uncommon condition that could become dangerous if ignored. Ethan remained calm, refusing to create unnecessary alarm. "There is no immediate emergency," he explained gently, "but I recommend more frequent monitoring during the next several weeks. Your body is recovering from the accident while also supporting the pregnancy. That combination requires extra attention." Sebastian listened carefully without interrupting. "Can it be managed?" Ethan gave a reassuring smile. "Yes. With proper care, regular examinations, adequate nutrition, and enough rest, the outlook remains very positive." Daniel quietly released a breath of relief from across the room. Ethan then surprised both men by placing a detailed handwritten care schedule on the table instead of prescribing unnecessary restrictions. "You do not need to stop living your life," he said. "You simply need to let your body heal at the pace it chooses." Sebastian looked at the schedule before meeting Ethan's eyes. "Most people would only tell me what I cannot do." Ethan smiled softly. "I prefer helping people understand what they still can do." Silence settled comfortably across the room for several moments. Sebastian realized no one had spoken to him with such straightforward kindness in many years. Ethan never appeared impressed by wealth, intimidated by security personnel, or curious about rumors surrounding the Hayes family. He focused only on the health of the patient sitting before him. Before Ethan prepared to leave, Sebastian quietly spoke again. "Would you consider overseeing my medical care until the pregnancy is complete?" Ethan paused thoughtfully. "If the hospital administration approves the arrangement and it remains medically appropriate, then yes. My responsibility is to provide the best care possible." Sebastian extended his hand with quiet gratitude. Ethan accepted the handshake naturally, and for the first time since the accident, neither man felt like a stranger to the other. As Ethan departed the private suite, Daniel remained beside Sebastian with a thoughtful smile. "You trust him already?" Sebastian watched the elevator doors close before answering. "No. I trust the person he chooses to be every single time no one is watching." Unknown to all three of them, several floors below, an unfamiliar visitor quietly asked hospital reception whether anyone had recently been assigned to the confidential recovery suite, setting into motion a new chain of events that neither Ethan nor Sebastian could yet foresee. The following week settled into an unusual routine that neither Ethan Carter nor Sebastian Hayes could have predicted. Every morning Ethan entered the private medical suite carrying updated charts, nutritional recommendations, and quiet encouragement instead of fear or unnecessary formality. Sebastian gradually recovered from the accident, but Ethan never allowed him to forget that healing required patience. "Recovery is not a race," Ethan reminded him during every examination. "Your body is doing two important jobs at once." Sebastian would simply nod, surprisingly willing to follow instructions from the one person who never treated him differently because of his influence. Daniel Brooks watched the growing trust with quiet satisfaction. For the first time in years, Sebastian accepted advice without argument. One afternoon Ethan completed another routine examination before reviewing the newest laboratory results. Everything remained stable, bringing visible relief to everyone in the room. "The pregnancy continues progressing very well," Ethan said with a reassuring smile. "Keep following the care plan, stay hydrated, avoid unnecessary stress, and attend every scheduled examination. Right now, both of you are doing exactly what you should be doing." Sebastian thanked him sincerely, and Ethan prepared to leave for the evening. As he walked through the hospital lobby, he noticed two unfamiliar visitors speaking politely with the reception desk. Their expensive clothing blended easily with ordinary business attire, yet something about their careful questions immediately caught Ethan's attention. They repeatedly asked whether a confidential patient had recently been transferred to another location and whether any new medical staff had been assigned to private care. Hospital employees refused to discuss confidential information, politely reminding the visitors that patient privacy could never be disclosed. Ethan quietly continued toward the exit without interrupting the conversation, but years of emergency nursing had taught him to notice details others often overlooked. The visitors never raised their voices, never behaved aggressively, and left the building calmly after receiving no information. Even so, Ethan found the encounter unusually unsettling. Later that evening, Daniel received a brief security update from the hospital's liaison officer. 2 unidentified individuals had attempted to gather information about restricted patients without violating any laws. Daniel immediately shared the report with Sebastian. After reading it carefully, Sebastian remained silent for several moments before looking toward the city lights outside his window. "Someone is trying to confirm whether I survived the crash," he said quietly. Daniel agreed. "They still do not know where you are or who is caring for you." Sebastian's expression became thoughtful rather than fearful. "Then Ethan must stay completely outside whatever questions they are asking." The following morning, Daniel visited Lakeshore Medical Center before Ethan's shift began. They met inside a quiet staff lounge where fresh coffee filled the room with a comforting aroma. Daniel spoke honestly. "There may be people attempting to learn more about the accident. We are not asking you to change your life. We simply want you to know that if anyone asks questions about Mr. Hayes or his medical condition, the safest answer is the one you have already been giving. Confidential information remains confidential." Ethan smiled gently. "That has always been my answer, regardless of who the patient is." Daniel appreciated the calm confidence. "I never doubted that." Ethan returned to the private suite a short time later carrying breakfast recommendations and updated examination forms as though nothing unusual had happened. Sebastian noticed the familiar calm expression immediately. "Good morning," he said. Ethan smiled warmly. "Good morning. Let us see how both of my patients are doing today." Sebastian quietly laughed for the first time since the accident. In that simple moment, the heavy atmosphere surrounding the investigation briefly disappeared, replaced by something far more valuable. Neither of them realized that the strongest protection surrounding the growing family was no longer the security team waiting outside the building. It was the quiet trust steadily growing between an Omega nurse who honored every promise and a Mafia Alpha who had finally found someone worthy of believing in. Several days later, Sebastian Hayes received medical clearance to leave the hospital under one important condition. Ethan Carter would continue supervising his prenatal care through regularly scheduled private appointments until the pregnancy reached a safer stage. Although Sebastian rarely accepted personal advice from anyone, he agreed immediately. Before leaving Lakeshore Medical Center, he quietly thanked every physician and nurse who had participated in his recovery, surprising many staff members who had expected someone of his reputation to remain distant. When Ethan escorted him toward the private exit, Sebastian paused beside the waiting vehicles. "I have one request," he said calmly. Ethan looked at him with professional curiosity. "What is it?" Sebastian answered without hesitation. "Continue treating me exactly the way you have since the first night. I do not want special treatment simply because you know who I am." Ethan smiled warmly. That was never going to change. Daniel Brooks quietly watched the exchange, recognizing that mutual respect had become something much deeper than ordinary trust. Over the following weeks, Ethan visited Sebastian's private estate for routine medical examinations approved through the hospital's confidential care program. The estate itself was far different from the intimidating rumors often whispered throughout the city. Instead of endless displays of luxury, Ethan discovered peaceful gardens, quiet libraries, elegant walking paths, and a staff whose greatest priority was maintaining a calm environment for Sebastian's recovery. During every appointment, Ethan focused entirely on medical care, carefully monitoring nutrition, exercise, stress levels, and the baby's healthy development. Between examinations, the conversations gradually became more personal. Sebastian spoke about growing up surrounded by responsibility long before he understood what childhood should feel like. Ethan shared stories about choosing nursing because his late mother had always believed compassion could save lives in ways medicine alone never could. One quiet afternoon after a successful examination, Sebastian invited Ethan to walk through the estate gardens before returning to the city. Colorful flowers lined peaceful stone pathways while gentle fountains softened the silence surrounding them. I used to think trust was something people earned through loyalty, Sebastian admitted thoughtfully. Now I think it begins when someone expects nothing in return. Ethan looked toward the blooming gardens before answering. Sometimes the strongest relationships begin because two people simply decide to keep showing up for one another. Sebastian smiled quietly, realizing those words described their growing connection perfectly. As they continued walking, Daniel approached with a tablet containing the latest security update. The unidentified individuals who visited the hospital have disappeared again, he reported calmly. Our investigators believe they were only trying to confirm whether the aircraft accident had any survivors. They never obtained confidential information. Ethan felt genuine relief. Then hopefully life can return to normal. Sebastian looked at him gently. I hope so too. That evening, after Ethan returned home, he found a small package waiting outside his front door. Inside was not an expensive gift, but a handwritten thank you card accompanied by a framed photograph of the sunrise over Lake Michigan taken from the hospital rooftop the morning after the rescue. There was no signature except for one short sentence written neatly across the bottom. Some mornings deserve to be remembered. Ethan smiled quietly as he placed the photograph on a nearby bookshelf. For the first time since the night of the crash, he realized the memory no longer reminded him of fear or uncertainty. Instead, it reminded him that one ordinary decision made with compassion had unexpectedly brought two completely different lives together. Across the city, Sebastian stood beside the nursery that was slowly being prepared for the child he already loved deeply. Looking through the large windows toward the lights of Chicago, he found himself wondering whether destiny had sent Ethan into the freezing lake only to save his life, or whether it had quietly given both of them the opportunity to discover a future neither had ever imagined possible. Autumn gradually gave way to the first days of winter, and Sebastian Hayes entered the final stage of his pregnancy surrounded by a calm that had not existed before the accident. Regular examinations continued exactly as Ethan Carter had planned, each appointment confirming that both parent and baby remained healthy. Ethan never allowed optimism to replace careful observation, but each encouraging result brought visible relief to everyone involved. One snowy afternoon, Ethan arrived at the estate carrying updated medical reports and a small notebook filled with recommendations for the weeks ahead. After completing another thorough examination, he smiled warmly. Everything looks excellent. The baby is growing exactly as expected, and your recovery from the crash is now complete. Sebastian quietly released a breath he had not realized he had been holding. So we are finally approaching the finish line. Ethan nodded gently. Yes, but this is the time to be even more patient. Your body has done remarkable work, and now it deserves every chance to finish safely. Instead of immediately discussing schedules and medication, Sebastian invited Ethan to the nursery that had slowly taken shape over the previous months. Warm afternoon sunlight filtered through large windows, illuminating wooden furniture, soft blankets, neatly arranged books, and a comfortable rocking chair placed beside the crib. Ethan looked around with quiet admiration. Every detail reflected careful preparation rather than luxury. It feels peaceful, Ethan said softly. Sebastian smiled. That is exactly what I wanted. I hope this child grows up knowing calm instead of fear. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the edge of the crib before replying. Children remember love far more than they remember expensive things. Sebastian looked thoughtfully at the nursery before speaking again. When I first woke up in that hospital, I believed surviving the crash would be the greatest miracle of my life. I was wrong. Ethan turned toward him with gentle curiosity. Sebastian continued, his voice steady and sincere. The miracle was meeting the person who reminded me that trust still exists. Ethan felt unexpectedly moved but answered with the same honesty that had always guided him. You trusted me because you chose to. I simply tried to deserve that trust every day afterward. Their conversation paused as Daniel Brooks quietly entered the nursery carrying the latest security report. He smiled before placing the folder on a nearby table. The investigation is officially complete. The authorities confirmed that the people asking questions after the crash were connected only to financial matters surrounding the aircraft, and every issue has now been resolved through lawful procedures. There are no remaining concerns for your family's safety." Sebastian thanked him sincerely before Daniel discreetly left the room, allowing the peaceful silence to return. Ethan looked relieved. "Then perhaps you can finally stop expecting another unexpected crisis." Sebastian laughed softly. "I would welcome an ordinary life for once." Later that evening, after Ethan prepared to leave, heavy snow began falling across the estate. Sebastian walked with him to the entrance despite Ethan insisting that he should remain indoors. Standing beneath the covered front steps, they watched snowflakes quietly blanket the gardens where they had once spoken as strangers learning to trust each other. Sebastian finally spoke the words he had considered for weeks. "After the baby is born, I hope you will still visit even when you are no longer my nurse." Ethan looked into his calm gray eyes before smiling with quiet warmth. "I was hoping you would ask." Neither of them rushed to define what their future might become. They simply understood that whatever happened next would be built on honesty, respect, and the countless ordinary moments that had slowly transformed two strangers into the most important people in each other's lives, while somewhere beyond the falling snow, a brand new chapter quietly waited to begin. 3 weeks later, the first warm light of dawn spread across Chicago as Ethan Carter hurried through the familiar doors of Lakeshore Medical Center after receiving an early morning call from Daniel Brooks. The message had been brief but calm. Sebastian Hayes had entered the final stage of labor, and both parent and baby were doing well. Ethan arrived at the private maternity suite with the same steady confidence that had guided him since the night of the plane crash. Sebastian looked tired but peaceful as he greeted Ethan with a grateful smile. "I was hoping you would be here." Ethan gently adjusted the monitoring equipment before answering. "I promised I would stay with you until everything was safely finished." The next several hours passed beneath the careful attention of physicians, nurses, and specialists who worked together with quiet professionalism. Ethan remained close, offering reassurance whenever Sebastian needed encouragement, reminding him to breathe calmly and conserve his strength. As the morning sunlight filled the room, a healthy baby entered the world, filling the peaceful suite with the beautiful sound every hopeful parent longs to hear. Tears quietly gathered in Sebastian's eyes as he held his child for the first time. For several long moments, he could not find the words to describe everything he felt. Ethan smiled warmly from nearby, his own eyes reflecting genuine happiness. "Congratulations," he said softly. "You both did wonderfully." Sebastian looked at the tiny face resting peacefully in his arms before turning toward Ethan. "Neither of us would be here without you." Ethan gently shook his head. "You found the strength yourself. I only helped guide the journey." During the following days, Sebastian recovered steadily while learning the simple routines of caring for a newborn. Ethan continued visiting the hospital, not because his professional responsibilities demanded it anymore, but because both Sebastian and the baby had quietly become important parts of his life. Daniel often smiled as he watched the peaceful conversations between them, realizing the distance that once separated an ordinary Omega nurse and a powerful Mafia Alpha had disappeared completely. A month later, after everyone returned home safely, 10 familiar black sport utility vehicles once again drove slowly through Ethan's quiet neighborhood. Curious neighbors smiled knowingly as the elegant convoy stopped outside the modest house where everything had unexpectedly begun. This time, however, there was no uncertainty waiting behind the dark windows. Sebastian stepped out carrying his baby securely in his arms while Daniel followed with several carefully wrapped boxes containing books, children's blankets, and handmade gifts from the estate staff. Ethan opened the front door, surprised but immediately smiling. Sebastian walked forward until they stood face to face. "I promised I would thank you properly one day," he said quietly. Ethan laughed softly. "You have thanked me many times already." Sebastian shook his head. "Not like this." He looked around the peaceful neighborhood before continuing. "I would like you to become part of our everyday life, not because you rescued me or because you cared for us, but because somewhere between that stormy night and this beautiful morning, you became family." Ethan looked at the sleeping baby, then back into Sebastian's calm gray eyes. The answer had been growing inside his heart for months. "I would like that very much." Sebastian smiled with the quiet happiness of someone who had finally reached home after a long journey. As the three of them stepped inside together, the neighborhood slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. Outside, the line of black sport utility vehicles no longer represented mystery, fear, or power. Instead, they marked the beginning of a future built on trust, compassion, and countless ordinary days shared together. Ethan often thought back to the storm that had changed everything and realized destiny had never asked him to rescue a powerful stranger. It had simply asked him to save one life with kindness, and in return, that single decision had given him a family he never expected, a child whose laughter would fill every new season with hope, and a love that proved the strongest promises are rarely spoken aloud because they are quietly lived every single day.